Hi, and welcome to today's Engaging for Missouri webinar. I'm Alice Roach from the Division of Applied Social Sciences at the University of Missouri, and I'll be your host today. With each of these 30-minute webinars, we intend to share research-based insights that leaders like you can apply in your own work to benefit and strengthen the state's agriculture and food system, hospitality sector, and communities. For today's webinar, we have Dr. Ray Massey here to present about the prospects for raising industrial hemp in Missouri. Before I invite Dr. Massey to begin, I want to share a few housekeeping notes. First, we'll close the webinar today with a question and answer session. Those of you who connected to today's webinar via your computer can submit your questions in the chat screen. So to open the chat, just click the chat button that you see at the bottom of your Zoom window. Alternatively, if you join by phone, you can send me your questions via email to roacham@missouri.edu. Second, all attendees are muted and may not start their video. Third, if you encounter any technical difficulties, then you can let me know by either submitting a comment in the chat screen, or you can also send me an email at roacham@missouri.edu. Fourth, we will make a recorded copy of this webinar available to you. You can look for an email from Zoom in about a day from now about where you can access that recorded copy. Additionally, you can find an archive of all of our previous Engaging for Missouri webinars on our division's YouTube page. So with that, we'll transition to the topic of today's webinar, which is titled Prospects for Industrial Hemp Production in Missouri. Presenting on this topic is Dr. Ray Massey, who is an agricultural and applied economics extension professor. Thank you, Ray, for presenting today. If you could please start your video and unmute your microphone, then we can begin your presentation.
All right, thank you, Alice, and welcome everybody. So yes, today I want to talk about a project that we did at the University of Missouri on industrial hemp production, and one of my major roles was looking at the cost of it to farmers and what they would be looking at if they chose to do that. So let me go ahead and begin this. And of course, I've got to make sure that I can, okay, there we go. So let me just show you real quick a little bit about the industrial hemp growth in the United States over the last couple of years. And you can see back in 2017 that we had perhaps about 30,000 acres grown. In 2018, it doubled. And in 2019, it quadrupled. So we had, I should say this is the number of licensed acres. Not all licensed acres were planted. You can see that on the right side of the screen that about half of them were planted. But essentially, we did see a quadrupling of licensed and planted acres in 2019. And states like Missouri are for the first time going to be able to plant this year, and so there is an expectation that we will have another increase. Your basic economics would say as supply goes up, we either have to have demand going up or we're going to have a problem with prices. So we do have quite a bit of growth. If we look at Missouri, the Missouri Department of Agriculture does have a hemp program. And they sent me their statistics of about a week ago and showed that they had 67 permits issued for producing and selling transplants, cuttings, clones, and viable seeds. So where you're going to get where you may get some of your genetics, we have 67 permits. Producers, we have 157 permits issued, and that was a total parcel acres of 22,000. And I just bounced back up. We had planted last year 255,000. So even if half of those acres were planted, we're adding 10,000 acres to the 255,000. And it was spread pretty much across the state with 55 counties being registered to plant. We also had 26 certified industrial hemp samplers permits issued. And so those are people that would be sampling hemp in the field to make sure that it meets USDA or really federal standards for THC. If you're a processor, you don't need a permit. And so we don't have a list of permitted processors in the state. But let's go on and just look at what industrial hemp is for and how it can be used in the state of Missouri or grown. There's 3 markets for it. You can grow it for fiber or grain or CBD. And this illustration here shows that depending on what part of the plant you're looking at, you're going to get different products out of it. So the stalk would be used for fiber. And, you know, we normally think of hemp rope or maybe even hemp cloth for fiber, but there are some quite innovative things that are being done by engineers to make hemp concrete or insulation or even some strengthening of plastics and things of that nature. But that's predominantly out of the stalk. Hemp for grain is you're actually harvesting the seed and using it either for human food or for bird seed or for other types of getting oil out of it and meal. Or you can get it for CBD, which is the flower that would not be fertilized. So before it became a seed, and hopefully you would not have any pollen floating around fertilizing it, but the flower would be used for CBD. So there's a lot of markets that are developing, and so the demand is likely to be increasing. The question is whether it will increase as fast as the supply has increased. So if you were to look at those three, what I usually say is if you're going to grow industrial hemp for fiber, it's going to be very similar to hay production. You're going to be paid by the tonnage, which is what you're paid for when you grow hay. You're going to use traditional haymaking equipment. You might go from a large round baler to a large square baler or rectangular baler. But hemp is tough. It wraps around the equipment, and so you may have a little bit more expense associated with dealing with hemp for fiber than you would of a grass or an alfalfa. But it is similar to hay production. If you're going to go with industrial hemp for grain, I would say it's very similar to the traditional grain production. You're going to be paid by the pound instead of by the bushel, but you are paid by the pound. You're going to use a combine to harvest that grain. Again, it's going to be a little taller. The header is going to be up a little bit higher. The wrapping is still going to be a problem, so you may have a little more wear and tear. But for the most part, you are going to be able to use traditional equipment to harvest industrial hemp for grain. When you come to the CBD market, you have a different animal. Unless you have grown tobacco or horticulture crops, growing hemp for CBD is going to be new. The way that you market it's going to be different. You are paid on a percent of CBD content per pound of biomass. Frequently, as I read the literature, a lot of people just quote pound of biomass, and they usually assume a 10% CBD content. But in your contracts, you'll see CBD contract per pound of biomass. The other thing that you're going to find with industrial hemp for CBD is it is exceptionally labor intensive. I'm going to show you a budget here in a few minutes that says it's going to use about 240 hours of labor per acre to grow hemp for CBD. And part of that is weeding, part of it's planting. We see a picture here of people using a planter. Part of it will be removing male plants, making sure that there aren't any male plants. There's ways that you take care of the plant, you harvest it, you hang it, just a ton of labor. And in the future, there may be some innovative mechanical solutions, but we don't have those right now. So real quick, I just want to show you, again, the cost that we have at the extension.missouri.edu industrial hemp site. All of these budgets were made in October, and I actually did not update them. So they should be updated, but I purposefully didn't so I could compare just kind of a forecast. But I have fiber, grain, and corn. And the reason I have corn is to just say a lot of folks that might be thinking about this are used to growing corn. And so how do we look at the fiber and grain if I'm used to growing a traditional Missouri crop? The income is pretty similar. I mean, the top one would be hemp grain at $720. That's probably less now, but even corn at $635 is less now because that's an October projection as well. One of the things that you're going to find though is seed, if you're growing fiber, is more expensive because you're going to plant so many seeds per acre. There'll be a little bit less fertilizer, but a lot more machinery. If you're growing hemp, you've got a monitoring and testing cost that you don't have with corn. And when it comes right down to it, the total cost go from $488 to about $598. The income for fiber at 27 is less than for corn at 68, but the income for grain at 232 is greater. So people might say, yes, this is an opportunity. Is it an opportunity that is just exciting? Perhaps. I mean, if I could go from 68 to 232, I'd be happy. But when I say that, at that point, I'd want to look at the uncertainty around it. And so the income I had here for grain of $720 was assuming a 60 cent per pound for my harvest, and that I'd harvest 1,200 pounds. I have here what happens if I just went down to 40 cents, or if I didn't have a 1,200 pound yield, I had a 1,000 pound yield, and you begin to see that it does get in the red. The thing I want to point out here real quickly is getting in the red, I'm only maybe $150, $160 into the red, but I can get there. So now I want to go to CBD for hemp, and at this point you really see it different. I'm bringing in a revenue of about $24,000. That's an assuming that I get $2 per percent per pound of biomass. Right now it's selling for less than $1, but this was an October price. My transplants are at $7,600. My machinery is almost at $3,000. My labor is over $3,000. I have total cost of $16,000 per acre. That's a lot of money. And so as people are saying, hey, I'm having a hard time with my cash flow for corn, you're going to have a really hard time cash flowing CBD just because it's so expensive. Now, you'll see down here in October, we were forecasting a potential income of $7,500 net income. I have the same thing here. What if I looked at uncertainty, went from $2 to $1.50 to $1, which, by the way, it is selling right now at approximately $1, maybe even a little less. I'm already losing $4,500 when I do that. And if I were to, instead of getting 10%, get 9% or 8% CBD per pound of biomass, I'm losing much more. And the numbers here, you can go on to extension.missouri.edu, get the spreadsheet, put in your expectations. But what I really want to just point out is for grain and fiber, I was looking at maybe losing $200 per acre if things go wrong. Here, I'm looking at losing several $1,000s per acre if things go wrong. So there's much more risk in this. And so let me kind of talk about the risk. This is the prices that were for CBD biomass in 2019. And you can see that in July, they were selling for over $4. October, selling for around $2. Came down to $1. Currently, it is less than $1. We just had a tremendous influx of material. And so biomass prices came down quite hard. If you look at the price of processed CBD biomass, I mean, the first thing that you would do is you would make what's called a winterized crude. It also fell from $6,000 per kilogram down to less than $1,000. The isolate went from over $6,000 to a little over $2,000, and the full spectrum distillate also reduced in price. So we see the price of the processed product going down and the price that farmers receive going down. And so CBD doesn't look quite as exciting as it did 6 months ago. And part of that reason is this value chain, which we're actually experiencing part of that problem with the COVID now of just, is the chain working properly? So I've been talking about growers and what they can do. I might just mention we have not grown it in Missouri before. This is our first year. 2020 is the first year that we can grow it. And so we don't have a lot of good experience as to what our yields would be, what kind of fertility we need, what insects or weed pressures we might be experiencing. But even from that, if you go back to seed and genetics and you read the news stories, there's a lot of just horror stories about not getting good genetics. In 2019, a lot of the bad news stories were processors were not able to accept commodity that they had expected to receive. And so we see that this chain can create a bottleneck or a problem for us with prices. And so one of the things I wanted to just share with you real quick is that there are a lot of risk associated with growing industrial hemp. And so we see production risk here, which I've kind of talked a little bit about. I didn't talk about the THC levels, but if you didn't have, or if your THC levels test too high, you actually just destroy the crop in the field and have zero income, but all of the expense associated with it. You've got some marketing and price risk. And again, we've talked about some stories about that. The financial risk is some of your banks may not be comfortable with this, but it is a legal product, the industrial hemp is. And so you should be able to get help with it, but you may have some people hesitate. And then you've got your legal and institutional risk of regulatory compliance, crossing state boundaries with this. What happens if your neighbor grows hemp for fiber, which allows the pollen to go around, but you're wanting CBD and you don't need any pollen around, just those kind of risk associated with it. So let me close by saying again, we did this study and put all of the information on the industrial hemp website at missouri.edu or extension.missouri.edu. Just type in industrial hemp, you'll find the budgets, you'll find the budget generator, and you'll also find three other publications dealing with the market change and opportunities for hemp as a processed product. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Alice right now and take questions.
Thank you, Ray. I want to just note too that on the previous slide that Ray showed of all the resources that are available, this was a project funded by the Missouri Agricultural and Small Business Development Authority. So we really appreciate their support of this project. We do have a couple of questions or comments that have been submitted. One, Ray, is how do the storage costs for hemp fiber and CBD hemp compare to that for hay?
Okay, if you're looking for hemp fiber, the storage costs are pretty much going to be the same, except you may find that you want to store it inside. One of the things that is different for hemp fiber or seed is they probably have a higher quality standard than we may be used to if we're just selling hay for feed or corn for feed. And so the big question is making sure that you do have the ability to harvest it clean and then maintain it clean and maintain it without it getting any mold, mildew, and things of that nature that will just disqualify it from being accepted by the contractor that you've contracted with.
Great. Here we have a comment too about the MDA license. So it looks like the agriculture, hemp, propagule, and seed permit is for sales only and does not authorize production. So that's just a note for listeners about a distinction about that permit. One question that I have is that on your slide, you mentioned that counterparty risk could cause a problem. So what are some different ways that producers can manage that counterparty risk?
That really is a great question, and it is probably one of the greatest risks that you face. So, just going back to 2019, Gencana was a pretty large processor of hemp. They contracted with a lot of farmers, and then when it came time for delivery, they were unable to pay the farmers for that delivered product. And so they eventually did declare bankruptcy. And that's what counterparty risk is. Counterparty risk is when somebody else is not living up to their end of the bargain or somehow affecting you in your production. You've done everything right, but someone else delivers it wrong. Another one would be you buy a seed that's supposed to be feminized and it's not all feminized, and so they're affecting you or something of that nature. So really the only way to help yourself in a new and emerging market like this is to do a lot of homework, have a lot of understanding of who you're dealing with, and trust. Now, that doesn't always solve the problem because Gencana actually was a very well-established, reputable processor. But even they had a difficulty. But as you start a new market like this, you're probably going to find a lot of other processors or input suppliers that are not as established, not quite as well financially able to get into the market. And so it's what they call due diligence, making sure that you will find out what their financial position is. Do they really have the financial wherewithal to buy your product? Do they have insurance of their own so that if something goes wrong because you bought a seed that wasn't the quality that you expected it to be, do they have insurance, liability insurance for that, or it's product liability insurance? And so you're really making sure that you're just not dealing with somebody that you found on the internet, but somebody that you have researched and are comfortable working with. That won't necessarily solve all the problems, but it will bring you a long ways towards making sure you are not caught in a problem.
Great, thanks for that explanation. You did mention that the Gencana firm has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. How does a bankruptcy filing like that affect the perception of opportunity for producing industrial hemp and then participating in that marketplace?
I think it probably is a good reminder that we are in a new industry, and the first movers make a lot of money, make a lot of noise, get a lot of excitement. But seeing somebody as large as Gencana filing for bankruptcy probably says, wait a minute, do I really have the opportunity to make money here? So there was a ton of excitement in 2019. Everybody wanted to do it. That's why we got the project here to investigate it. And I think it was just a wake-up call that, yes, there is opportunity, but it is not going to be just money flowing through everybody's hands and everybody happy. So it's a wake-up call.
Great, thanks. We have a question here about, on one of your previous slides, you talked about the number of counties where permits for growing hemp have been awarded. Do you have any idea about the geographic distribution of where those counties are located? This question in particular is asking how many are north of Highway 36, for example.
I have to say that I know that they are distributed across the state, but I don't know how many would be north of Highway 36. I do have a list of those. I could give it, the person could email me at massey@missouri.edu. Before I would send out that list, I'd actually talk with Alan at the Missouri Department of Agriculture, who gave me the list, to make sure it's appropriate. But they could also probably call Missouri Department of Agriculture Hemp Program, because they are giving out information on this type of stuff.
Great, thank you. Some media reports recently have described how test results can vary significantly. So what I mean by that is the THC content. You may send the same sample or quite similar sample to different labs and get markedly different results. So what can producers do to make sure that they're getting the most valid tests that they can?
Well, yes, testing is a problem. Again, the protocol is being developed, or I should say is new. And so there is questions of how to make sure that testing is proper. And real quick, before I go into too much detail, just to make sure everybody understands, when you grow a crop, it has to be tested either at harvest or within 2 weeks of harvest. for THC, which is the hallucinogenic factor or compound in hemp, and it's got to be below 0.3% THC. There are the words are skipping me right now, but there's kind of confidence intervals around that 0.3%. So you might be able to get a test and it comes back at 0.4, and it would still be legitimate because of the confidence interval, or still be legal for market because of the confidence interval that's around it. Having said that, there are questions, you send it to different labs and you'll get different results. The same thing happens if you send a soil sample to different labs, you get different results. So what some people are doing is they are taking repeated samples throughout the year of their THC, particularly if they're growing it for CBD, because that's where it's so expensive and you maybe afford to sample it repeatedly. Sending it in, having it tested, making sure that they're comfortable with where it's at, and then when they finally do deliver for THC, well, there's two tests. For THC, they'll make sure that it's not going to go above it by testing it throughout the year. And if it gets too high, they're going to maybe harvest early. But for if you're out wanting to know about CBD, which it's sold on percent CBD per pound, you will want to take your sample and actually keep part of it for yourself, or send it off to an independent lab other than the processor that you sent it to, so that you're getting an idea that the processor is giving you a fair shake. So testing is critical, and it typically is repeated to make sure that it's right.
Great, thanks for that. Another question here is about crop insurance. So this year, USDA made the multi-peril crop insurance program a risk management option for some hemp producers in some counties of some states. Missouri wasn't listed as one of those states where producers in certain counties were able to apply for that crop insurance. So how likely is that to change in the future, and what would cause that to change, where Missouri hemp producers have the option to access that crop insurance?
Okay, so that was really a risk management agency decision. So the risk management agency is the agency that oversees crop insurance of all sorts. And so Missouri does have whole farm revenue protection for hemp producers, and it's complex. People don't normally use it. So they would like, as you mentioned, just revenue protection or yield protection. That was not for Missouri. And when the risk management agency brings on any new commodity, they typically introduce it in just a few states to kind of test it. The states that I've seen that have been part of the pilot program, which this is a pilot program, are states that have grown industrial hemp in the past. So Colorado, Kansas, Kentucky have all grown industrial hemp in 2019. So they have some yield estimates that would be used in 2020, whereas we have absolutely no yield estimates. I would assume that if the project works well, the pilot project works well in the states that have it, the risk management agency will introduce that to other states as they begin to have data, and they'll make tweaks to the program so it can be expanded to other states.
Great. So we'll keep watch on that item then. I think we have time for one more question. The U.S. has historically imported quite a lot of hemp material. Particularly, China has been a very large international supplier of hemp fiber. So given how COVID-19 has changed supply chains, is there a new opportunity for domestic producers to supply some of that hemp fiber, for example, and compete more readily with those international suppliers?
There's always opportunity. So we are still wanting to maintain trade with China. So I wouldn't say that we're just going to cut off trade with China, even with regard to hemp. But because of any type of trade we'd have with China, we have the logistical questions of making sure all the transportation and licensing works. It becomes more expensive to get it here. And so that is somewhat of a benefit for our markets right now, is we have more opportunity than we did 6 months ago, probably.
Great. Well, it's time to close now. Thank you, Ray, for sharing today's webinar presentation, and thank you to our audience too. When you exit Zoom, you'll see a post-webinar survey will load in your browser. If you could please consider responding to that survey, we'll use your feedback to improve the webinar experience and also brainstorm future webinar topics. Again, you should receive a recorded copy of today's webinar via your email within about a day from now. On Monday, we'll begin next week's Engaging for Missouri webinars with a presentation from Dr. Justin Dyer, who is a professor of political science at the University of Missouri. He will speak about constitutional rights during crisis. You can look for an email later today about next week's webinar schedule. Again, thanks for joining us and enjoy your weekend.